Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jessica, and to NAMI Santa Fe for inviting me to come back and talk about this. It's one of the things I love to talk about most, human ingenuity and creativity. And tonight I'm going to stir things up in a number of ways. I'm going to talk to you about yourself. I'm going to talk about some updates from the neurosciences on the relationship between creativity and mental illness. And so this is fresh information within the last few years. And so it's exciting to be able to bring you some different information. And maybe if you've heard me talk before, you will hear some things again, but I've tried to make them fresh and new and put the narrative together in a way that's informational and interesting. I'm a doctor of educational psychology and cognitive neuroscience. I have a practice called 2E Consults LLC in Espanola, and I work with families and kids. I work across the lifespan, and I work with organizations that support families and kids to help animate results from testing and assessment. I do training, I do coaching. So what you're going to hear me talk about tonight is right from the core of who I am and what I do. There we go. The mantra that I adopted when I started this work, so for 15 years, I was a neuroimaging scientist and an academic. And so I learned plenty working in neuroimaging labs about what humans do with their minds and their brains. And when I came back into the wild, into practice, it was motivated by a change in the autism diagnosis because a lot of the research funding went away very quickly when the insurance model for autism changed. So that was what catapulted me really back out into the wild, because by that time I thought I've learned enough in neuroscience, which is the story of the grand mean and the group average, that I could help individuals, because we are all individuals. So even though our science has to be the story of an average, how we apply the science on behalf of people in daily life is really important and something that I'm dedicated to. So I'm going to kind of dip into mental illness and disability this way. The Maori word for autism, and Maori are a tribe in New Zealand, their word for autism is takawatanga, and it means in their own time and space. And autism is one of the disabilities that I've spent a good amount of time studying and serving these days. And being in your own time and space is a great way to think about it, because people on the autism spectrum have a different sense of timing about them. We see it socially, we see it in their learning, we see it in their sensory preferences, but that in your own time and space it's a kind way to think about all of that instead of some of the harsh ways that we tend to observe or define things in the literature. So a little bit more about me. Leadership, in my mind, is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. So one of my favorite verbs is tending, because that's how I view what I do. I tend people and I tend individual differences. And then this second, by Mary Oliver, Instructions for Living a Life. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And in the business of humans and human ingenuity and trying to improve learning opportunity and life quality, that is an absolute imperative. So here are 3 interpretations of disabilities and the way that I function in practice for people. Dyslexia is like a webbed toe in the brain. And that came from a 9-year-old girl who, in her natural state, was kind of like Pippi Longstocking, very animated and bright and bubbly. But when she learned she had dyslexia, as her mother described it, the lights went out. And when I was explaining to her that what that is just a piece of brain tissue smaller than your pinky fingernail, when I said that to her, her eyes popped open and she said, "Oh, my brain has a webbed toe." And I thought, if everybody could conceptualize dyslexia that way, and then we could get on with the work, it would be different. Autism Autism is just the sensory cortex trying to do the job of the entire brain. And there are things that happen developmentally when someone has autism spectrum disorder, where they're very tiny. And as the brain begins to develop from just being sensory, just needing care and feeding and starting to be social and notice the world, those brain connections go all over the brain. Only in somebody who has autism, the sensory cortex creates a pause and says, no, wait, I'm the whole brain right now. I can keep doing this job. And essentially what autism is just that pause in timing where the brain goes ahead and develops. But because of that moment, it develops in a slightly different way, and it develops more so that brain is parallel processing information more than converging information. So again, if the world could understand that just all autism is the sensory cortex trying to lead the brain, we would look at it differently. And I think we could do some different and creative things. And then ADHD just means that you can see connections that are farther range than most people. And the fun information that I have that I'm going to share as an update tonight relates heavily to autism and ADHD. Because in the last, let's say, 5 years, this is where people have been continuing to dig in under the surface. Here we go. So let's get things rolling with an inspiring clip from The Creative Brain, which is a movie that came out on Netflix. It's not currently available, but the trailer is, and I thought it might get the juices flowing.
I think originality is bunk. I think it's nonsense. There never has been such a thing as true originality.
Creativity doesn't mean inventing something out of nothing. Instead, it's about refashioning what already exists.
The ideas that you have, the concepts that you have are tools that will empower you to do more than you could without them before the Empire State Building was built. Someone imagined it, then they built it, and now it's part of the real world.
If someone's like, that's weird, I'm like, yes, because it means they don't know it, if they're unfamiliar with it. And that's always kind of what I'm trying to do.
I think science is inherently creative. I think you have to be to discover something new that other people have not discovered already.
Regardless of what you do for a living, creativity and the creative part of your being is essential to your happiness.
All my experiences off the piano have something to do with what I'm doing on the piano.
After the Gulf War, I went to school trying to find something I could do for the rest of my life, and it just kind of happened with ceramics.
It's always easier to be a critic than a creator. This is our chandelier.
Find myself when I write. I create a whole nother world, the world that I'm supposed to be living in.
Because of this experience in my life, I was able to be reborn inside. And I am somebody that I never knew I could be.
So I could kind of sit around on a silken cushion and ideas kind of come down. That doesn't actually happen.
To be creative, to think outside the proverbial box, you have to be willing to be wrong.
What do you have to do to be able to join in? You have to try your best and you have to take risks.
Sometimes it hurts like hell. It's embarrassing. And people get mad at you. It's hard, man. It's not a comfortable position all the time.
And of course, that is what creativity is, that we actually have the power to imagine the world that isn't our world yet.
I think.
Right. So I wanted to show that clip because it expresses so many dimensions of creativity in such a short time and space. And when we're asking questions about human ingenuity, and you saw all of the different contexts where creativity bears, we know that mental illness is debilitating, right? It is not a fancy thought, oh, if you are mentally ill, you can go and be hugely creative, because mental illness, when it's really waging its war, it's debilitating. And intense moments of suffering and imbalance in and of themselves do not lead to creativity. They lead to suffering. However, the world now is getting more interested in this relationship, and there are things that we do know about ourselves that we can leverage and harness and apply. So one of those skills that gets impacted by mental illness has to do with flexibility and shifting. And that's a big skill, because when someone is stuck and when mental illness is raging and waging its war, a person is stuck, right? They're completely overcome. So they can't possibly attach to anything outside of that moment. And that's really important, because the executive functions in the frontal lobes of our brain help execute everything that we know, everything that we are, and everything that we know how to do. And so flexibility is like one of the fundamental bricks of healthy function, and it's most influenced by mental illness. And these brains help me show you that one of the ways that we can impose flexibility in weaker moments is to follow our routine, right? The daily deal. Because when you're in a moment where you're not feeling flexible, but you have a day, you have to go to work. You have to take care of somebody. You have errands to run. Your routine can be a saving grace, because that artificially makes you be flexible throughout your day, even if you're fighting it. But it can help. Preferred activities, like the brains in the middle, of course, if I told you tomorrow is yours, go do what you would like, you would know immediately what you were going to do, where you were going to go, who you're going to do those things with. That kind of flexibility is easy. But it's those big emotions and being stuck that create the overwhelm that we perceive as negative emotion. But here's a thing that relates to creativity, that our consciousness, we assign value to emotions and feelings that the brain doesn't. And frustration can feel negative and irritating. Think of little times of frustration. Oh, I wish I could do something other than what I'm doing. Or I'm tired of this illness because for 4 days I haven't been able to leave my house. It can feel negative and irritating. But if you can hold a part of yourself back to understand that that kind of grit, that kind of discomfort, when you recognize it the right way, it can also be a signal of impending change, and impending change that can be positive. So here's a little strategy. When you are in a moment of stuck, I want you to think whatever you're thinking, but then I want you to end the sentence and say, period. And then I want you to say, for now. So anything negative that might have you stuck, think it, ruminate it, feel it, but at the end, punctuate it and say, for now. And that period is important. This is when grammar is good for your mental health, because it's that stop where you say, this is really not optimal, but only for now. It's going to change. My life experience tells me if I'm stuck in this moment, things will eventually change. And I could actually contribute to that if I can catch myself in this way. So whatever it is, the ticker tape running in your mind, put a period at the end of it and say, for now. Take that breath and move on. Why is this important? It's important because, back to the executive functioning, this is the not very sexy part of creativity, but it helps support it quite a bit. And the executive functions in the frontal lobes of our brain, the physical connections for those skills aren't fully mature until you're 25 years old. And there's a lot that happens before the age of 25 in a person's life. But that flexibility, that is one of the cardinal skills of this suite. And this paper, 2023, this research group measures that individuals who can think about their thinking, who can put the period at the end of the sentence and say to themselves, for now, which is going to start to deflate that big emotion, that when you can have that kind of influence over yourself, it leads to great divergent thinking. So divergence is, here's a tomato. How many recipes can you name in the next 20 seconds that involves a tomato? Do it. That's divergent thinking. Convergent is, oh, I'm going to give you 5 vegetables in the garden. Looking at those 5 vegetables in the garden as fast as you can, what recipes could you make with all of those? So it's collapsing all the things into one big thing. And so talking about flexibility and executive functioning, this is something that modern times are helping us keep track of with ourselves. And a little bit into the talk, we're going to talk about mindfulness, more about mindfulness, because the power and medicine of mindfulness is giving us back a little bit of this composure and recovering it more quickly in moments when mental illness is trying to win. So the creative brain thrives on novelty, chews on novelty really well. Okay, how many recipes from one tomato, or 5 garden vegetables, how many recipes with all of them, right? When I said that, you guys all got a little bit of incentive. You got a little bit of dopamine, like, oh, I'm going to think about that for a second. Okay. And when the brain starts to get familiar with something, it can conserve its energy. It doesn't need as much energy. So think about if you've ever seen the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell, where his character relives the same day every day. And it's funny, but after a while you think, oh gosh, here we go again. Okay. But this picture of the brain, this is a study that shows the energy needed the more you repeat the same thing. So this is a brain extending energy on the 3rd repetition of something. Let's say memorizing a new word. On the 6th repetition, it needs a little less energy. By the 12th, even less. And by the 24th repetition, there is barely any metabolism being devoted to that thing, right? It kind of goes under the surface. And when we're practicing a skill like swinging a tennis racket, playing an instrument, speaking another language, that is becoming a skill. That less energy needed can be a good thing. But in creativity, it kind of goes against the grain, because in creative problem solving, what you're looking for is that burst of dopamine, the novelty and the surprise, which throws the brain back into high energy. Okay. So another way to look at this is a clip I took from an article about insight and creativity. And this particular graduate student, had this rapper named Mike Eagle. So Mike Eagle was going into the MRI, and they took an MRI study of him rapping freestyle. And then they had him perform in his brain a memorized piece, something he'd already recorded in the can, no problem. And when you look at the memorized piece, you see the blue regions. So that's the brain like giving it back, calling it out. But the orange, which is very different, you don't see very much overlap. The orange is the brain springing into surprise, saying, oh, he wants me to come up with something brand new. I'm gonna improv. Okay. And when we compare that to life, How much time do you spend improvising in your life? You have the day you plan, and then you have the day that actually unfolds. And so I would argue that a lot of times we are freestyling our thinking when we are confronted with things that we didn't expect, we didn't plan, that we didn't schedule. And if we could begin to think of those things in a novelty way, like instead of, oh no, and be kind of downtrodden about those surprises, if you can keep a piece of yourself back and say, oh, this is novel, right? It's not the thing I plan on doing. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it is novel. And what this graph is showing us, this picture is our brain is going to show up differently when we're confronted with something that is more freestyle versus more memorized. And when it comes to mental illness and conditions that people think are less optimal, when I talk to people and they think, well, I come from a family that struggles with abuse, addiction, mental illness, these different things, like what chance do I have? And just like you saw in the movie clip at the end, there were incarcerated people talking about the time that incarceration gave them to reimagine themselves, to rediscover themselves, to tap into something that they didn't know was there before. It's important that in these moments that we understand, that you understand you're not your inheritance. Why is that? Why can I say that? I can say that there's two explanations. The first one is on this page. Epigenetics is how experiences of previous generations affect who we are. And what we know about epigenetics is that traits, disease disposition, physical things, mental things, behavioral things can jump generations and families. And so in certain cases, when people think, my parents had these struggles and issues, I might have these struggles and issues, I often say, no, think back, look at your grandparents, your greats. Behind them, if you're lucky enough to know your family's history, oral or written, but there are certain things that skip. And so you should never just think you're a foregone conclusion when there are certain kinds of struggle, because epigenetics leaves the door open for other things to come through us that are invited by certain conditions and environments. So you don't have to be your inheritance. The second reason that I can say this is that when you look at the purple arrows in these brain scans, they're pointing to the frontal lobes that I've been talking about, that are the basic skills that support bigger things for creativity and problem solving. And the purple arrows, the executive functions, they are under heavy influence in your family line. We do inherit our executives from our families. But the counterpoint to that are those green arrows that point to areas for language, emotion, and memory. And those parts of the brain are under more open influence to the environment and to your choices, motivations, and preferences. So it's a balance. And what we know of epigenetics, things skipping, coming across generations or over a generation from a great to a great grandchild, let's say, you, and knowing that the brain isn't nature or, it's nature and nurture, and that there are things that we can do to influence the outcome, period, for now. So now that I've laid that groundwork, what aspects of creativity is mental illness closer to than people might realize? When mental illness is having its way, people can experience a loss of control. In that loss of control, they also experience the loss of their ego. meaning I, a perception of me and I really goes by the wayside until that subsides. And the question is does that experience at all convey creativity? Because if you think about, famous artists and their reputations for having big egos or being very dramatic or self-centered, but then you have to think about that person and imagine them doing what they do. Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Da Vinci sketching, an anatomical sketch of the leg in minute detail. And in those moments, their ego isn't present because they've given themselves over to something else. So there's not an answer to that question. But in my mind, that is a way to think about creativity within mental illness, and that people who are artistic or are intensely creative and have mental illness, that maybe that's one of the pathways in, because what mental illness does is it facilitates those experiences ahead of someone who doesn't have mental illness and may have a very stable reality and perception of reality. So that's an open question. And so the uniqueness of being human, here we live in a time where we know that animals problem solve in complex ways, right? We always read about the emotional intelligence of an octopus, the amazing problem solving capacities of the great apes and the ravens and the crows. On the other side of that, artificial intelligence is flooding our world. And so here we are as the unique human being with the frontal lobes of our brain that make us more than an animal, and the capacity to be innovative and creative and responsive with artificial intelligence coming on the scene. So our capacity to play is a big deal. It's important in this because that's what leads to creativity. That's what creates the opening of creativity, because we all need it regardless of who we are, how we feel. Play is an antidote. We know that social play involves others, and social play might sound very fluffy, but in the world of mental illness, social play can be one of the hardest things for somebody to do. Locomotive play can sharpen physical skills and rehearsal. An object, playing with toys, instruments, sports equipment. Play is serious, but play is also safe, because the intention of play is, if things go wrong, no big deal. But keeping the play mindset in moments that are pretty serious, this is the paradox I challenge you with. Because if you can keep a mindset of play, hold that space when you are confronted with something that is not play, things will shift. So some of the ways we kind of cut ourselves off a little bit is that we view things like distraction and procrastination to be enemies of learning, enemies of doing things and being productive, except that distraction and procrastination, they're two ways our nervous system talks to us and tells us, hey, wait a second, I need a minute, and I know it's not convenient, and I know there are other things happening, but this is what I need internally, metabolically. Because what that's queuing up, what it's managing inside of us is dopamine, which is that chemistry of reward, of motivation, of I want this, I want to be better, I want to heal, I want a different outlook. Anytime you have that pull, it's a visceral feeling, that's dopamine. And that is the chemistry of creativity. It's the chemistry of healing, because what it promotes is a feeling of relief and focus and calm inside of us. And so I talked a little bit with you about the not so sexy part of creativity, the executive functions. You have to tend your flexibility even when you don't feel like it. And that's something that you might have to do. You're going to have to put effort into that. And it can be hard. But it's easier if you know that you have two systems in your brain, one underneath the effort, and the other one, it helps you do things and it dances in the background so that you can feel and be your best. And it's very responsive to everything that you do. It's responsive to disease and mental illness. It shifts in response to disease and mental illness, but it can also be influenced by meditation and mindfulness. So back to that, if you can hold a tiny bit of space in a moment that's serious for play, or you can say, period, for now, this thing is terrible, but it has a finite ending. You're calling half of your capacity back that might be squashed underneath what's going on. And so things like procrastination and distraction and mind wandering can actually be beneficial. And your system, again, telling you, wait a second. And you might say, oh, but that slide said it was a dance and you're calling it a resting state. Well, science calls it a resting state, but it's the metabolic part of your brain. It's like the autonomic beat of your heart, the breath of your lungs. This is how the brain handles things and moves things and orchestrates on your behalf. This isn't something you can tell. It just is doing what it's doing. But your feeling of it is self-reflection and memory, your own memories. Okay. Or when the mind is wandering. And so this is a slice of brains, and all of those colorful pieces are the resting state of the brain. And it kind of looks like it's a brain talking to itself. And it's that internal coordination for something good is coming. I'm holding space for this. This person is suffering in moment A, but moment B is coming, and I can connect the two. This is the resting state talking. I can connect how they're feeling right now with something in the future that hasn't happened yet, because this person is feeling bad, but they're imagining a moment of healing. They're looking forward to relief. And that is the magic of the resting state space. In this slide, this is from some of my research. The red brains on the top were typically developing children in this study. And that's what their resting state looks like. And the color is only one color because that resting state is all connected, fires and wires together. The bottom brains with all of the colors, those kids had autism spectrum disorder. And remember, I said that autism is just the sensory cortex trying to do the job of the whole brain. The consequence of that pause was that it caused those connections. They still developed, but they went a little independent of each other instead. And they went to the same neighborhoods, but they ended up in different houses. And so the resting state of someone who has autism is functioning differently than a typical person's. It's still there. It still conveys a benefit, but this leads to the different behaviors and temperaments that we see across people who have autism. So just as a summary, what does the resting state do? It helps support flexibility. It serves as a gateway for where you are now to join into the future. And this happens in our imaginations. Think about all of the things that you audition in your mind for. I wish, I want, I'm going to plan. And there you are in your present state, but you're kind of casting forward in your imagination to connect who you are, where you are, and what you are with these other possibilities. And by doing that, that leads to creative insight and the generation of new ideas. and creativity. And so I told you mindfulness influences the resting state, because mindfulness is all these different things. Yes, it can be meditation and affirmations and sitting in a certain place in a certain way with certain tools and supports. But mindfulness can take a breath of a second, noticing, sitting in the parking lot, noticing the tree in front of your car, saying something nice to yourself, noticing, oh, I haven't had a moment of quiet all day. Oh, the sun feels really good coming in the window. Mindfulness can be immediate and simple. I statements, okay? I feel, I want, I am. Anytime you can do that, you just called that resting state. You just doubled the capacity that you have for a moment. And this is a list that came off of social media that's for kids. I love it because in the absence of anybody else saying these things to you, sometimes we have to say them to ourselves. But doing these things, saying these things to ourselves isn't just, okay, I'm trying to make myself feel better. You're literally shifting that autonomic part of your thinking and feeling into gear so that it can support whatever's happening to you. And it only takes a second. You can say to yourself, I'm upset, but it's okay to be upset. My thoughts are interesting to me. I need to take a deep breath. I trust my own judgment. I appreciate my effort. I'm putting a lot of time and effort into this. That resting state comes rushing in, and all of a sudden you've got twice the capacity you had before you did that. The problem is still there. The complexity is still there, but all of a sudden you've got twice the resource that you had a second before that. My third recommendation before I shift to the science, turning awe, again, those moments where you feel overcome, the moments where you need to put the period at the end of the sentence and say, this is hard, but just for now, is turning that awe, I'm feeling really bad. I'm feeling sorry for myself. And if you take that awe, but you look up and you look outside or at somebody across from you, and all of a sudden you're looking at something bigger than yourself. And the inspiration for this, of course, I have all these pictures of the Northern Lights that my good colleague Adrian moved to Sweden, and this is what he does for a living. He runs around making beauty, capturing this beauty. Or on the right side of the picture, these are stones on a table in my house, and they're small. I can hold them in my hand, but they still inspire in moments where you put them in the light. They inspire the awe of a grand scene. Sometimes we don't have a grand scene, but we can find awe in smaller things. And so just that connection of mindfulness and your own resting state and calling your own capacity, taking awe and shifting it to awe. All right, so some good news. ADHD medication does not appear in the studies that have been done right now to impair creativity. And this is often a question that people ask. If I take this medicine, is it going to hurt my creativity? Is it going to change my personality? And the study that speaks to this, there are 2 or 3 in the recent literature. People are interested in this. And they're looking at methylphenidate, Ritalin. But what they're finding is, no, it does not impair creativity. But what it helps support are some of the executive functions. I have this little list here because those are some key points from that study. But the upshot of what this team found in this paper is that the medicine helps support the executive functioning, right? The flexibility, the ability to flex out of a moment where you're being overcome. that it improves that, and that it did not appear to hurt convergent or divergent thinking processes related to creativity. Divergent, 1 tomato, what's 5 things you can do with it? Convergent, here's 5 garden vegetables, what recipe would you make? All right, so diverging and converging. So here's another one, creativity and ADHD. They did not find negative influence on creativity. Okay, so 2 papers that support you can take your medicine, it won't hurt your ability to be creative, to be thinking on your own behalf creatively. Another paper suggested that hyperfocus and flow are the same. And hyperfocus, we hear a lot about that in ADHD and autism, perseveration, getting very, very focused. And this little list, this is hyperfocus. So just jumping into a task wholeheartedly, giving heightened attention to only that one thing. The environment disappears around you. You don't hear the call of your name. But there's an assumption that that kind of hyperfocus can lead to creative flow. And in my dissertation back in 2000 now, I was looking at boys that had ADHD and gifted boys that had ADHD and what the electrical signature looked like on the tops of their scalps using EEG. And what we found was that hyperfocus, when boys who were super smart and had ADHD, when they were hyperfocused, their creativity went way up. It was a benefit. And so you could say, oh, that went to flow. But hyperfocus can also be perseveration, right? A focus on or rumination on something that is repetitive and doesn't give rise to anything else. So this is, again, I'm bringing it forward because these are 2 concepts important in creativity research. And it's exciting. I'm excited to see that the field is getting interested in, are these the same thing? Are they different? All of my publications suggest they're 2 different things. Perseveration on one end and hyperfocus being positive. So the jury's still out, but here we are. This is a graph from another study where they looked at people on the autism spectrum and people with hyperactivity with ADHD, and they didn't see any differences. I'm over here on the right between the population that had autism versus ADHD. And those were the hyperactive, impulsive things like playing quietly. Can they control blurting out? Can they settle down? Can they be still? And you can see there's a lot of overlap in the 2 populations. But what they found that surprised them was that people on the autism spectrum had what they call an attentional strength, where people on the spectrum, better than people with ADHD, could organize, they could keep track of things, they could sustain their attention, they could give productive attention to detail. And so this is one of the first studies that I've seen that really starts to take apart and say, hey, you know what? In neurodivergent populations, the news is not all bad. Okay. If we know that the big moments of mental illness, creativity, there won't be a rise of creativity from that, unless it's the subjective experience of the person, which is always on the table. But now,
Jess, is your screen frozen too? Yeah, it is frozen.
My screen is frozen too. I was just going to ask as well. This is Mercedes.
Mine unfroze.
Mine is
Okay.
frozen.
Jess, can we text Layne and make sure she knows?
Yeah.
You want me to text her, Jess?
I don't have any sound. Brandy says she has sound.
I think we've lost her from the
Hi.
Zoom connection.
Yep, Zoom went down. Okay.
Okay. You want to share again? We're all set.
Yes. Yep. Oh gosh. Let's see. Ah. Now I have to take my own medicine, right? This is novel. Okay. All right. So I think when it crashed, I was talking about the fact that now we have this concept of attentional strengths being conveyed in people on the autism spectrum. And that's something that is, again, is adding to this layer and this notion that, you know, this applies to all of us, irregardless of moment of wellness. But it's exciting to see this particular thing finding come out on behalf of people on the spectrum. And so this final piece I want to show you has to do with creative thinking and achievement, also in ADHD and autism spectrum, and a little more about the tests. So the alternative uses task for divergent thinking, I gave you okay, here's the tomato. What 5 recipes can you make? 1, 2, 3, go. The alternate uses task gives, let's say, 4 objects. Here's a newspaper, a belt, cardboard box, and a can. Okay, and oops. Tell me all of the different things that each one of those could be. And that measures creative processes. There's that word flexibility, which is the not sexy executive function, but there it is being measured as a fundamental aspect of creativity. Fluency, how many ideas and the originality of those ideas. And then the second, the remote associates test, I'll skip here. You get things like, here's some words at the top: square, cardboard, and open. What one thing do those 3 words suggest? A box. At the bottom, an aid, a rubber, and a wagon. A band-aid. A harder one, wheel, hand, and shopping. Oh, that's a cart. Or wise, work, and tower. That's a clock. So when we talk about creativity being studied in the way that we're talking about it, these are the tests that get used. But if you think back to the movie clip I showed you and all of the different ways that creativity comes to bear on science, medicine, art, human life, this is the way we study it, which is kind of flat when you think about life. But there you go. So these attentional strengths in autism spectrum convey perseveration, when someone's ruminating, depressed, or flow when they've completely fallen in love with what they're doing. And that particular paper, did they see impairment? No. Did they see poor flexibility? No. Did they see perseveration? They did, and perfectionism. And when they were interviewing the adults in the study that had ADHD, because remember, ADHD the numbers didn't really show for them. They showed on behalf of autism spectrum. But the interview with people that had ADHD, they were saying, no, in that moment, I'm not impaired and I'm not stuck. But I am perseverating because I'm trying to get something just right. And I want everything to come out perfect. And so this is important because the data showed no particular difference for the people that had ADHD. But the qualitative part of it, the interview, they were able to say, hey, you didn't see a change in the numbers. However, this is what was going on in my mind. I wasn't stuck. And I wasn't having a moment where I was feeling impaired. I was just super focused on trying to get it right and perfect. So, in closing, I've tried to take you very quickly in the hour that we have through some mindfulness, through a new awareness that the resting state gives rise to our imaginations, keeps the door open, and connects what's happening now with the possibilities of the future. And that is like a fundamental of what creativity is. We are learning now that the scientific community wants to know the difference between perseveration and hyperfocus and flow, because they can all look like the same thing on the outside. And the data is starting to show us there is a way to talk about neurodivergent strengths and strengths in mental illness, and where the experiences of mental illness may open a door for people to be closer to creativity because of the moments they experience a loss of control and a loss of ego. Because moments of creativity for anyone, I think, have that requirement of the self falling away, and whatever is coming through is coming through. So my parting thought and a thank you is, Bruce Lee said, don't speak negatively about yourself, even as a joke. Your body doesn't know the difference. Remember, the brain doesn't assign the value to feelings and experiences the way we do. It can be neutral underneath all of that. That frustration doesn't have to mean breakdown. It could mean impending change. So words are energy and cast spells. That's why it's called spelling. I'd never heard that before. Made me laugh. So change the way you speak about yourself, and you can change your life. What you're not changing, you are also choosing. And again, back to the teaching about your resting state. All you need to do to call it is an I statement. And that is a mindfulness technique in under a second that will call the rest of your capacity into a moment that's hard, period, for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalbfleisch. Really, really fantastic talk. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has something they'd like to ask, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or you're welcome just to raise your hand, and we'll be glad to deal with it that way.
I'll ask a question. Hi, Layne.
Hi, Betty. Good to see you.
So we often hear that people with mental illness have problems with executive functioning. Is that due to the deficits in the frontal cortex? Or is that trauma? Or what is that?
Yes to both of those things. We know about the neurobiology of mental illness that the frontal lobes are kind of the associated place where
affected parts of the brain.
Yeah, it's heavily, and because the executive functions are also guided out from that tissue, they're hard to take apart. That's why there is that vulnerability to being stuck, to being not flexible, to having trouble with emotional control in certain instances, or regulating behavior, self-regulating behavior. But when you have trauma heightens those systems, right? So that they're even more sensitive than they might be. There is a very robust discussion about when autism masks trauma, or certain people trauma can manifest with autistic symptoms. And I know when I'm helping families that have both of those things, I'm paying careful attention to trying to help them kind of separate out what's related to trauma, what's related to biology. And it can be difficult, but that's, you know, that's a good question. And the two things that you brought, the either or is they could be both, but it's really important for people serving people with these, having these issues, that you can try to account for both of those things because they can mask each other.
But that doesn't have to be a permanent situation.
Mm-mm.
It can relearn.
Yes. Yep. The brain is plastic. It responds to experience. Back to, you know, you are not your inheritance. And the frontal lobes are, we inherit it from our family. That's the frontal lobes are under more influence from our genetics, but our memories, our emotions, our language, our experience, those parts of the brain are way more open to our choices and our environment. So there's lots of opportunity there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from our hand up from Miss Kimberly Gregory. You're muted, Miss Gregory. There you go.
There we go. So I'm here from Arizona, and I just wanted to make a quick statement, but this was amazing. I love understanding and learning everything about neuroscience, the brain, and whatnot. So just to lighten the load a little bit, so I work for MatForce. We do presentations in schools and in the community, and I've turned into kind of the science brain nerd of the company. And so just to share, I sent my boss a message letting her know that I'm in this meeting, and I told her that everybody should be glad that I still have yet to refer to the executive brain functioning as being unsexy. And so just thought I'd share that. Appreciate it, but now I kind of want to start using it. So this was fantastic. Thank you so much for the presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kimberly.
Excellent. Anyone else? Any questions? Well, I'll go ahead and ask a real quick one, Layne, because as you were talking through all the I statements and the awareness, I wondered what you see as the role of just being curious about your mind sort of plays with what you're learning from, well, whether it's mindfulness or something else, and it's just sort of the role of just that curious awareness of how one is thinking and sort of being able to step back and watch it.
Mm-hmm. That is one of the fundamental requirements, that curiosity, because, you know, the I statement could be, I'm curious about, you know, that I want to learn more. I want to go there. I want to taste this. I want to experience this. That curiosity is what allows you to put a foot forward or your mind forward. And, you know, the academic literature talks about big C versus little c creativity, big C being, you know, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, little c being, wow, I'm going to make a new recipe for breakfast I've never had before, right? You know, creativity can be imagined in all these different ways, but I would argue that, you know, even more than big C, little c of the outcome, the first C is curiosity. And as much as holding space of that period for now to disrupt something, it's the next thought is that curiosity. That's the recommendation for the awe of, you know, you might not have a magical scene, but a rock on the coffee table, something that has a story for you. That curiosity is everything. Thank you for that question. Great.
Okay. We're at the end of
I think Jessica had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jess, did I miss it? Go ahead.
Sorry, my hand was kind of in my dark background, but I was just so fascinated when you're talking about how you have these artists who are famous and they're known for having these big egos. And I was wondering, do you think that could be a protective mechanism? Like if they get into that creative state so often, then maybe they develop a bigger ego to sort of balance things out. If when they're in the creative state, they're not ego driven. I don't know if you have an answer, but
Could be, right. You could think of the little seesaw, right? Or the big seesaw of, if I'm going to let go and be in this moment and give myself over to something, then out of it, I have to reground myself. So I think ego could definitely be compensatory. In the same way that I was thinking in mental illness, perhaps one of the overlaps is that moment where there is a loss of control, right? Yourself kind of dissolves in certain moments, and that is a moment of creativity like that too. Yeah, by all accounts it is. And so maybe that's where some of the fruit is for the overlap, because I definitely, we don't know this story yet. We don't know the full story.
thank you.
I have one more question. We have a few more minutes.
Mhm.
You had a slide, Layne, that said that medication for ADHD does not impair creativity. Medication for ADHD is probably a different type of medication than people with mental illness take. But what we hear from people who take psychiatric medications is they feel that it does impair their creativity. Is that just their perception, or?
No, that doesn't take away from reports at all. I had never seen the science literature try to address the effect that medicine has on cognition. And because I work so much with kids and families, and I see a lot of ADHD, and I see kids who are resistant, I don't want to take that medicine, or parents say, we don't want to give that medicine because we don't want to impair their creativity. So I feel like it's a study showing that science is willing to prioritize that question. And I was delighted to see that Ritalin it helps calm down the brain so a person can focus. There are developmental studies that have shown that the kids that are medicated properly over a 5-year time course, that their brain development catches up in ways that it was behind. This study is about 10 years old now. But the subjective report of how medicine feels and what it does is something that's been kind of left to subjective psychiatry in the office. And so just to see that a study is looking into that, 2 studies were looking into that, it makes me happy, because if they're curious about that, then it opens up a line of research for other psychiatric medications.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Layne. I always appreciate your doing these talks for us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Anytime. Ask anytime. It's a pleasure to be with you.